Hi everyone, this is a video on 4.3 arguments for and against trade control and protection. So far we've already been able to see some winners and losers from trade protection from looking at the diagrams, but now we're going to delve just a little bit deeper. So we'll start with arguments for trade protection. Health and safety. There are administrative barriers in place for legitimate health and safety reasons. For example, we can't import things that are illegal to be sold in Australia, such as semi-automatic weapons. That's for our safety. We also have standards on the quality of goods that can be sold, generally due to safety concerns. So if you're ever having trouble sleeping, you could read the standards that portable metal ladders must meet to be sold in Australia. With regards to the environment, Australia has strict rules about importing fruit due to fruit fly and untreated wood due to the invasive insects that can come inside it. Okay, government revenue. So you should be thinking steel in the US. So every time a US company imported steel, a tariff was paid to the government. I want you to draw in where this would be on the tariff diagram. Yeah, I'm sure you get it right. It's right here. It's the vertical distance between the supply curves, which is the extent of the tariff, multiplied by the number of imports that there are. So between Q3 and Q4. We also do trade protection to protect infant industries. Infant industries are young industries that haven't yet gained economies of scale. So therefore, they're unable to compete with imports from established overseas industries. It is argued that governments must care for and protect them, much like we would a human infant, in order for them to grow. As we can see in the diagram, imposing a tariff increases the price that domestic industries receive. Remember, it goes from PW to PW plus tariff, and it also increases the quantity produced. So this in turn increases the revenue, as we can see here. So it protects them, it lets them grow. Okay, this one's simple. Protection of jobs. This was one of Trump's arguments. He wanted to protect jobs in the steel industry. As we can see, if they produce more steel and aluminium, Q1 to Q3, then they likely need more people to do that production. So it should protect those jobs. National security was another justification for the Trump tariffs on steel. The idea being that if US steel industry ceases to exist, the country may be vulnerable as they do not have the resources to make their own weapons. Anti-dumping. A common reason given for countries imposing tariffs is to combat what we call dumping. Dumping is when a country sells exports for below the cost of production, and that would usually be due to subsidies given by the government. This is the justification given by China for the recent tariffs on Australian wine. Australia are good at making wine. We have the climate, soil, and the skills for it. So it's sold at PAUS, P Australia. What China claim is that the Australian government are unfairly supporting the industry with subsidies. They therefore put tariffs in place to, in their mind, level the playing field. It makes imported wine from Australia less competitive because it raises the price. This is the market for wine in China. Raises the price. So therefore, the Chinese producers can make more when Australian wine is so much more expensive. The Australian government and the wine industry strongly refute any of those dumping claims. And this is an example of where dumping claims can hide the true reasons behind tariffs. Unfair competition takes into account dumping, as per the previous slide, as well as undervalued currencies and misuse of administrative trade protections. As we know, if a country's currency depreciates in value, it makes their exports more attractive, as they will appear cheaper to their trading partners. Governments also know this and at times may manipulate the value of their currency to help their exporters. So they might lower it. Governments will do that, and later in the course we will study the ways in which they could do this. So we'll go into much more detail later. Accusations of currency manipulation do occur. So we can see in this tweet from Donald Trump that he's accusing the Chinese of this. Similar to dumping, however, the allegations are hard to prove and they can be used to justify increased tariffs. We saw earlier the legitimate reasons that a country might impose administrative trade barriers. But these do have the potential to be used to an extreme extent, such that fair, reasonable competition is not allowed in a country. So this can lead their trading partners wanting to retaliate with trade protection of their own. Okay, this is a mouthful. Diversification for economically least developed countries. So economically least developed countries share a common trait when it comes to trade. Their export revenue is usually dominated by the export of one good, usually a commodity such as oil. Take a look at this table. So we see, for example, Chad, their major export is oil, and it's 92% of their exports, right? As we will learn when we look more specifically at development, a country being so specialized in one commodity carries great risk. So Chad, with their reliance on oil, they risk losing a huge amount of revenue if the oil price falls, which we know it can fluctuate quite a bit. So that revenue could be used to fund their development, but it's at risk here. So due to this risk, ELDCs, as we call them, they may want to diversify their economy and produce a wider variety of goods and spread some of the risk around. However, to do this, they need to compete with imports, and these would become infant industries in the ELDCs. So they would need to impose trade protections to protect those infant industries. Okay, the balance of payments. Where's the title? There it is. The balance of payments is a topic that we'll look at in depth a little bit later in the course, in a few weeks. In short, it's concerned with the amount of money leaving the country as opposed to the money coming in, mainly in the form of imports being much greater than exports. Trade protection should limit the number of imports. Okay, arguments against trade protection, the misallocation of resources. So misallocation of resources is all about welfare loss, where society is now worse off due to the trade protection. We worked through this in a previous video. So we draw this diagram and we think, how did we get here? So we learnt where these welfare losses are, but how did we get here? Before the tariff, consumer and producer surplus look like this, right? That you should be nodding along. That should look good. And then after, when the tariff is introduced, the consumer surplus will shrink, producer surplus grows, and the government makes this tariff revenue, the government revenue from the tariff, and that leaves these two areas, which used to be consumer surplus, are now nothing. Those are benefits that have been lost to society. Okay. And for a quota diagram, here's our quota diagram. The welfare loss is found in the same spot as in the tariff diagrams. The only difference is that this area here is quota revenue. This is revenue for the foreign producers rather than being revenue to the government. So this is still gained by someone in society. It's just not consumers, producers, or the government, local consumers or producers. And we still have these areas that are lost due to the quota being imposed. And they are for the same reason. Now, a production subsidy. So cars in Australia, misallocation of resources due to a production subsidy is only this area. So we don't have the misallocation due to consumers not consuming the same quantity. That's because the price stays the same with this type of trade protection. What we have is the mix of production changing. We now have more inefficient local firms producing the quantity between Q1 and Q3. That's why we get this inefficiency, because Australian firms just aren't as good at making cars. And the more efficient foreign firms are producing a smaller quantity now. That's why we only have this one quantity due to the inefficient producers. Okay, retaliation. If a country imposes tariffs on imports, it should be no surprise that the other country will retaliate because they're hurting their industries. This is exactly what happened between the US and China in their trade war recently. The US started because they thought China weren't playing by the rules, right? So they put tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods that come into the US. Then China retaliated. They said, well, wait a sec, $34 billion of tariffs on your goods. Then the US retaliated. Then China retaliated. This went on for a bit. There's an old saying that nobody wins a trade war, and this video is really laying out some of these reasons for you. We can see the bad things that happen in a trade war. We can get increased costs and higher prices. So back to Trump. We've spoken about him a lot. We can see that steel and aluminium have a higher price now. So this cost gets passed on to every US industry that uses steel and aluminium as inputs. Now, what happens when costs of production increase across an economy? That's right. When we think of costs of production, we think of short-run aggregate supply in macroeconomic sense, and it shifts to the left, and that leaves us with higher price levels across the economy. Okay, reduced export competitiveness. Think of the car industry in the US with brands like Chevrolet. They now have higher costs because they need steel and aluminium to make their cars. So they have higher costs, which leads to a higher final price for their cars. So higher cost in microeconomics we show with the decrease in supply. And this makes their exports of cars far less competitive when they're competing in, say, the Australian market. And this, of course, applies to other industries, other manufacturing industries. We get less choice. So Australian car manufacturing, both subsidies and tariffs kept out the foreign-made cars as they couldn't compete with the protection that we were giving, that the Australian government was giving the car industry. Australians, therefore, had a limited choice of cars to choose from. Not all brands were bringing their cars to Australia. Australian cars again. When an industry is protected so much that they have little competition, so it means they don't have to continuously improve in order to keep their market share. They sort of hide behind the trade protection in place. Many argue that this is why the Australian car industry was so ineffective. They didn't have enough competition. So normally with competition, you're trying to cut your costs as much as possible, be as efficient as possible. But that didn't really happen in Australia. And many would say that this would lead to the demise of the Australian car industry. Okay, hope you've taken good notes. We'll go through some of these ideas more in class.